Good afternoon and welcome to the senior oral of Marin. She was my senior assistant in logic and served in some other classes as well. She did a wonderful job. I enjoyed having her. On me with the panel is Mary Henson and Pat Blackburn. Let me go ahead and pray and then Father, we come before you as a good and loving Father, and we're gracious for the life of Marin, the lady that you built her to be. And so, God, we ask that you would fill her with the truth. Let her hearts and minds be receptive to receive the things that she has to say. We ask that you would bless this time, that the conversation would be honoring to you. We ask this in your good name.
Imagine there is a police officer who has just walked into a crime scene. It is his job to look at what has happened and figure out what took place and who the culprit is. As he begins to investigate, he starts to realize that somebody he knows was likely involved in the crime. He doesn't want his friend to get in trouble, so he ignores certain pieces of evidence so that he can come to a conclusion that he likes. Now, we would say that this officer is being irresponsible. He has a job to find the truth regardless of what that may be, and he is deliberately neglecting this responsibility. Surprisingly, this officer is not alone in this struggle. It can be easy to let your wants or desires change how you see truth. It happens every day, and often we do not even realize it. For example, look at the many news outlets that we use. Depending on your political views and opinions, you can go to a given website and hear exactly what you want to. You would have to try to find an opinion that is different from your own and use that to piece together what is really true. Or if you are on a team of some kind and you do not listen to what your coach tells you, how are you ever going to learn or grow? In The Republic, Plato details a scenario in which he describes a cave. This would not be MCA if somebody didn't use this example, so I decided to. In the cave, there are people who are chained up to rocks facing a wall. They have never left the cave and have no point of reference for anything other than it. There are people behind them with a fire going, and they are holding up objects so that the shadow is portrayed on the wall in front of the people who are chained up. The people behind them could hold up a flower and say that it was a bird. The people who are chained up would take that to be true because they have never had any other outside experience. Plato says, "To them, I said, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images." The only way the people could ever learn what is really true is by leaving the cave, and many of them would not do this even if they were given the opportunity. Leaving what you have always known can be scary and uncomfortable because you do not know what you will find. We want to hear and see things that make us feel good, and often we will sacrifice truth for this. This begs the question, why do our desires affect how we see truth? It is clear to see when a person is letting their desires change how they see the world around them. They may cherry pick and only look at sides of a story that they agree with. They often have a hard time admitting mistakes and sometimes even rule out the possibility of being wrong entirely. At this point, it becomes easy to act purely based on what you initially want in a moment and think about it later. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt uses the analogy of an elephant and a rider to explain this instance. The elephant represents a person's automatic processes like emotion, intuition, and desire. The rider represents a person's controlled processes such as reasoning and logic. The job of the rider is to make sure that the elephant makes good decisions in the moment. But sometimes, the elephant will take off in one direction, and the rider will have to explain whatever just happened. Haidt says, "The rider is skilled at fabricating post-hoc explanations for whatever the elephant has just done, and it is good at finding reasons to justify whatever the elephant wants to do next." This scenario happens constantly in everyday life, and it is not necessarily a bad thing. If you see a child who is about to touch a hot stove, your first reaction is to try to stop them. You do not pause to wonder why you want to stop them, because if you did, it would be too late. However, it is just as easy for this to become a negative thing. Imagine you have been frustrated with a friend or family member, and they do something to upset you, and you immediately start yelling. Later, once you have calmed down, you start to reason through why you were justified in yelling at them. Maybe they yelled at you the day before, so now you're even, or maybe you had a lot of stress in your life at that time. After the fact, these reasons may seem fine, but if you had paused to take the time to think through them before, you would have realized that you were not actually justified in your actions. In this case, the elephant took off in one direction, making the decision to start yelling. The rider was forced to try to catch up and come up with a logical explanation as to what just happened. It is easy to make decisions based on what you initially want to do, but in some cases, it is important to take the time to pause and think through why you want to do something. We have discussed the extreme of letting only your desires influence your decision making, but what about the other side of that? What if somebody totally ignores their desires and only looks at facts? This person would seemingly have no emotion or bias at all. They would probably have a difficult time developing deep relationships with people. Dallas Willard, author of Renovation of the Heart, said, "Healthy feelings, properly ordered among themselves, are essential to a good life. Without any feelings, it becomes difficult to want much of anything at all. And if you do not deeply want anything, you have nothing to work towards. So if you go too far one way, you can lose your motivation. But if you go too far the other way, you can lose your grip on reality." It is important to remember that desires do have a place in the search for truth. Oftentimes, the want to learn or know something new can actually be what begins the desire to search for truth. In most situations, you will probably prefer one outcome over the other, which is inevitable. Our desires come from God, and they should not be ignored or feared. When I spoke with Jay Mayo, who is a teaching minister at Stonegate Fellowship, he cited Psalms 37:4, which says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." It is clear from this verse that God does not want us to ignore their desires because they are a good thing. They only become a bad thing whenever we place them in an area where they should not be, or when we pursue fulfilling them in a negative way. When talking about this verse, it is important to remember two things. The first is that just because you have a close relationship with God does not guarantee He'll give you whatever you want. The second is that when you are in a close relationship with God, your desires begin to line up with His, and you start to want the same things that He does. One way to tell if a desire is helpful or harmful is to identify why you have that particular desire. For example, many people want to win games. Some people want to win because they want to make someone else proud. Some people want to make somebody lose. Some people want to win just because winning is fun. All of these people want the same thing, but they have slightly different reasons for it. The one thing that all of their reasons have in common is that they are influenced most by other people. Other people are often what influences our desires more than anything. The first person wants to make somebody else happy. The second wants to make someone upset. And the last wants to make sure that they accomplish something before someone else does. In Rhetoric 1 and 2, we talked about how, as a speaker, it is your job to persuade your audience of what you are saying. But this persuasion is not limited to a person standing at a podium. Every day, we are influenced by the people we surround ourselves with, and vice versa. Other people have the power to change our thoughts, feelings, actions, desires, and anything else. Another way people can influence your desires is if they can alter whether or not you get what you want. For example, maybe you want a raise at your job and your boss is the only person who can make that happen. To get the raise, you will try to work hard and make your boss want to give you the raise by wanting to reward you. In this scenario, you are not working hard specifically to do a good job. You are doing it so that somebody will notice and give you something that you want. One way or another, people are often what affects our wants and desires the most. In today's culture, the idea of finding your own truth and being your own person is highly promoted. People say that once you have your own opinion, there's no reason to listen to outside opinions because you've already made up your mind and their truth is not the same as your truth. This way of living is blissful ignorance. If you totally ignore what the other side has to say, you are shutting yourself off from the chance to grow. You are essentially saying that you know better than everyone else and that no one has anything else to offer you. By only hearing one side of the story, you are not open to other possibilities that could be out there. And you may be perfectly happy because it seems like everything is going your way. At this point, you will have to choose the truth over your own desires. If you stick with only seeing what you want to see, you will be left wondering what possibilities you might have missed out on. But if you search for the truth, regardless of what you might find, you will know that you found what all could possibly be out there, and have a more full understanding of truth. The question we sought to answer is, how do our desires affect how we see truth? There are 3 main answers. The first is that we want to be comfortable. It is much easier to live in complacency than to go out and try to change or grow. The second reason is that our desires are influenced most by other people. Depending on the people you are surrounded by, you will start to want the same things as they do, and vice versa. Lastly, when we follow God, our desires start to align with His. Not only are we growing closer to God when we have a good relationship with Him, we are getting closer to the truth, because all truth comes from God. Let's return to the police officer from the beginning. He is faced with the choice of either doing only what he wants or doing what he knows is right and pursuing the truth wherever it may take him. Like him, we should not be afraid of finding what the truth is, even if it may be painful or uncomfortable, because the truth is out there. Thank you.
Great job, Marin.
Thank you.
So I'll begin with our obligatory question now. What are your plans for next year?
I'm going to attend Texas Tech University, and I haven't decided what I'm going to study yet.
Get your guns up.
Yes.
I'm all for that decision. Okay. So I'm curious, what brought you to study the desire's effect on truth?
I was watching a documentary with my dad, and it was about flat earthers. And so they were trying to prove that the earth was flat, and so they would do these experiments, and in every experiment they proved themselves wrong, which I thought was pretty surprising. But and every time they would just say, like, oh, if we change this one thing, like we would see that we're right, and they would not even admit that the earth could be round. And so watching it, I was like, wow, these people are crazy. Like, they're not, like, how can they not see what's right in front of them? And so then the more I thought about that, I started to kind of notice it in smaller ways in my life, of like, maybe I don't know, I was comfortable with what I already knew, so I didn't want to try to admit that I could be wrong, or I didn't want to say, oh, someone else could be right, or I didn't consider that possibility. And so I just kind of, I don't know, I thought that it was an important thing, that it can be on a very large scale or a very small scale, and I feel like it's not talked about very much, and so that's kind of how I landed on it.
Well, I'm glad you did. I've really enjoyed thinking about this topic and looking at some of the answers that you've addressed and given. So I'm curious, maybe on a large scale, thinking about this, what are some big desires God's put in your life?
In my life personally? Probably to go to college, to graduate. Those are 2 things. I want to... I don't know, I probably would want to have a family and get married one day. Things like that, probably.
Yeah, and you would say those are good desires,
yes.
Right? Now, you also say that not all desires are inherently bad, right?
Yes.
But don't people think that there are some bad desires?
Yes.
Right?
I think desire itself is not inherently bad. It's how we go about fulfilling it that makes it bad. So, like, wanting money isn't a bad thing. So if you like work hard and earn that money yourself, like, that's good. But if you try to steal that money from somebody else, then that's when it becomes a negative thing.
So there's always something that you're really desiring that's good, and it's how you go about that. You're saying that is where we get in trouble. That labels something bad, wanting to eat all of the cake in the fridge instead of just a piece, or to eat it before you eat veggies. It's how you go about it. I mean, wanting the cake isn't bad.
Yeah.
Right. So what gets us off on the rails when we're wanting this desire that's good, but we go about it in a bad way? What gets us off the rails on achieving that good end?
I think a lot of times the bad ways that we go about fulfilling desires is more of a shortcut, and so we want to take an easier route to... We see it as the same end, just an easier means to that end, I think. And also, since we do live in a fallen world, there are temptations of like, oh, why do this difficult thing when you could just do this instead and get the same thing? Like, why would you do that? So I think that would be a way.
Shortcutting how to get to things. Why would you think that God would make the world so that it could be difficult to attain some good things?
Well, I think God made the world good, and it became evil whenever sin entered the world. Can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I don't forget.
Yeah, if it's hard to attain some of these good ends and we go about it wrong, how come God made the world, or did he make in the world the way so that it's difficult to attain those good ends?
Yeah, so I think that Satan came into the world, he brought evil with him, and so he is actively trying to work, as Christians, he's trying to work against us so that we don't get the good things that God has for us. He wants to make sure that we're away from God's goodness, and so he's going to do whatever he can to do that.
Okay. So in line with your thinking here, you talk about this detective who throws away some of these pieces of evidence. What do you think are some of these pieces of evidence that, on the larger scale, maybe we do every day? What are some of these things that, when we're looking for the truth or seeking something out, we decide to overlook or don't take into effect?
I think sometimes it could be things that affect us personally. So if there's something that reminds us of a part of us that maybe we don't like, then we're like, oh, that makes me really uncomfortable. I don't want to see that. I'm just going to look over here. Or sometimes if it's too difficult to pursue truth all the way, we'll just kind of almost pursue parts of it and only look at certain sides of the story so that it's easier and something that we're more comfortable with or that we like better.
So that we go about it in a way that reflects better on us.
Yes.
Do you think we do this consciously? Do we intend to take out part of the picture or not look at part of the picture, or do you think we do this largely subconsciously?
I think it could go either way. I think it's easier to notice it in somebody else than in yourself. So I think we'll consciously see it in other people, but it's more difficult to notice it happening in ourselves. And I don't know if anybody's ever deliberately, well, maybe. I guess it depends on the situation. Like, I know in some crimes, people will ignore pieces of evidence because a certain person was involved. But I think it does depend on the situation, and I think it could go either way.
Would you think that in most people you know or have experienced that it's subconscious or conscious?
In most people I've known, I think it's probably subconscious.
Yeah, that's what I find in my life is it's mainly subconscious, right? And the scripture says that the heart is deceitfully wicked, right? Above all, who can know it? And so I normally don't tell myself I'm like, not really looking for the truth. I normally think, oh yeah, I'm really looking for the truth, but I go about it in a way that's not really honest. So if that's how a lot of us go about these things, how do we seek things in a way that helps us not be, I guess, looking over some pieces of truth or evidence? How do we have ourselves acquire the truth in a good way?
So how do we take everything into account, basically, to find the truth? I think you have to not be afraid of finding the truth, firstly, and acknowledge you may or may not like what you find. I think that's an important step. And can you repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, how do we go about finding the truth in a good way that we don't overlook some of these pieces of evidence, like the cop?
Yeah, I think that, and then also comparing everything that we see to what God says, because all truth does come from God, and making sure that everything measures up to what He says, because that's where we're actually going to find truth, is in God.
What would you say to the person who goes, okay, sure, yeah, maybe I do that, but on some level, I'm human. I just can't take every fact into account, so you can't fault me.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, I don't think you can ever take every fact into account because you can't ever know everything, but I think you can take into account the things that you are able to know. I think you have to make an effort to do that, and there are going to be mistakes, nobody's perfect, but I think you do have to make a conscious effort, and you have to want to really find what is true to do that.
Okay. One or two more questions. One, it's interesting talking about desires. we say that there's three things that we can change. We say, you can change your attitude, who you trust, and your actions. How come we don't say your desires? How come that's not something we say that you have control over?
I think it could fall under your actions because, desiring something could be considered an action. So I think it could just be like a subcategory of that, and it's not specifically stated. That would be my first thought.
Yeah, that might be the case, huh? So if it's part of our actions, how would we be able to say if we're, we have some desires that we need to form better desires? How do we go about chasing or changing our desires towards something that's better?
I think evaluating how much you really need whatever you desire and what it would cost you. Because if it's going to just totally take away everything from you, is that really worth having that thing? And just thinking, how crucial is this to my everyday life? Like, how much do I really, really need this? And is it more of a need or a want? Also, I think that would be important.
What would the difference be between a need and a want with your desires?
I think a want would be something not superficial, but something you could probably live without. And then a need would be, you still want it, but it's more important to your everyday life.
I see. Thank you.
Hey, Marin, awesome job.
Thank you.
So I really like the elephant analogy that you used from the book you read, and so I think a lot of my questions are going to stay in that realm of the zoo.
Okay.
So you said that there's a rider on the elephant, so the elephant is kind of representative of your desires, and then there's a rider sitting on it, and when the rider is, riding correctly, they're kind of prodding the elephant, with truth, basically. And so one of the things that made me think of or curious about is, do you think that there's any truths that don't have a logical or verbal expression? Like, are there times when there's a truth you need to communicate, and you're just not going to be able to have a prod?
Can you clarify a little bit?
So are there different truths, I guess, that just you can't really communicate verbally, that it's maybe like something but there's not necessarily a way to express it?
I don't know exactly. Maybe, I don't know. I wonder if it could be like the truth of God, if we kind of know that in ourselves, because like He made us and we're made in His image. I wonder if it could be that. I don't know if that's what you mean exactly, but that's the first thing that I can think of.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that happens like a lot when we're growing too, that it's like maybe kind of instinctually, like, I guess that is something that does have, a verbal expression, but it's like, I don't really know how to embody that, like, right in the moment type thing. So I think it happens in growth a lot too. And then, do you think it's always good to get the elephant on track, like, as fast as possible? Like, so when it starts to shift somewhere, like, should we try to get it back on track, like, as quickly as we can?
I think it depends on, like, the scale of the situation. So I did say also, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, like the child touching the stove. You want to stop them, that's a good thing. I think if it's a situation like that, it's going to be fine. But if it's a bigger situation where there's bigger stakes, I think it is important to make sure that your wants and your desires are in check and that they line up with what is good for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I thought a lot about how, like, Jesus communicated with people, and it kind of goes to Rachel's oral a little bit, is that it seems like rather than just, like, kind of laying out the facts, like, here's A to B, whatever, and just a logical progression, like, he uses a story most of the time, and it seems like a little more roundabout way to, like, correct somebody than just to tell them, like, this is what you need to do, because, like, God knew what they need. And so why do you think someone like Jesus employed like story in prodding people's elephants rather than just like, whacking it with a fact, I guess.
I think it's because it was something, the stories he used were very specific to the people he was talking to, and so they could easily connect it to their lives and see how, like, oh, this does affect me and I do this too. And so it was easy for them to see how important it was and how it was relevant to them.
Gotcha. So what, I guess, maybe going off of that, like, what are some stories that you like that you kind of help use to, like, correct yourself? Or, like, when do you see that story is important, and when have you seen that just, like, bearing down and the facts of the situation are more important?
Honestly, I tend to lean more towards facts of the situation. That's a lot easier for me.
Casey just laughed at you.
I don't know. I can't think of a story off the top of my head. I'm sure I will later. I generally lean towards the facts of a situation because it's something that's very tangible and I can see it right in front of me.
Yeah.
It just makes more sense to me personally.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the other things I thought about, one of my last questions is, so like with prodding the elephant and stuff like that, thinking about I think it's James, where he's talking about the tongue is like a very small thing, but it, is like a rudder that a very small movement like can steer the whole ship. And so I think a lot of times, especially, putting it in the context of an elephant, like this elephant is just this like huge thing that's going to take a lot of force to control, and yet James says you can make a small movement with your tongue and alter the course of your body, or you can make a small movement with a rudder and like alter the course of the ship. And so what are some small things, like small practical things that you think you can use to like control the elephant and kind of where you're going?
I just had it and then I lost it. I think acknowledging whenever it has gone off track is the first step, and realizing kind of where you are and what your actual situation is a good first step. And then also why it has happened. And so to get it, did you ask to get it back on track?
Yeah, to get it back on track, or just to help like guide it around some too.
Okay. Yeah, I think also, an easy thing to do is just to go back to what God says is true, because that's what we know for a fact is true. And I think to make sure that you, no matter what, you're always going back to that, and that's the standard by which you're living wherever you are.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of times it is easy to like just compartmentalize those like truth and your desires and forget that like we're supposed to be working together as a team, and it's like better when we're working together as a team. And so I like that of just like gently getting it back on track, because it keeps the team mindset. So that's awesome. That's all I have for now.
Well, Marin, like everything else you do, you did that with such excellence. You're doing so good now. Saw you on the volleyball court for 3 years. At least I did, getting to see you perform so excellently in the classroom, and the way you carried yourself around as a senior this year. Just so proud of you.
Thank you.
My first question is related to Plato's cave, and how people are in there and chained, so that all they can see is the shadows. They only see a two-dimensional world. What are the chains for us that keep us from seeing the truth, to seeing the current reality?
I think it could be our circumstances. I think for a lot of people, it would be wanting to be comfortable, because, they do have the choice to leave the cave, but they're comfortable because they've always known the cave, they've always known the chains, and it's just something that has always been with them. And so I think choosing to be comfortable would probably be what the chains are for a lot of people.
How about some preconceived notions that they had? Can you think of some things along that line that, it's because of the way I've been trained, or it's because of what my friends say, or this is what the music of the day is telling me, or any of those possible chains that would keep you from getting to
like
reality?
Assumptions. I feel like whenever we hear somebody from a side that we may not agree with, whenever we hear them say something, we automatically rule out, like, oh, what they're saying is wrong. Like, they couldn't be right. Like, they don't agree with me. They can't be right. And so I think assuming that we know everything also could be one, and just, like you said, preconceived notions of here's what's true and there's no other possibility. I think that could also definitely be one.
I've been in education for a long time, Christian education, most recently for over 2 decades, and before that I was in public schools. And one of the criticisms of a Christian education was that you kind of get blinders, that you don't see all of reality, that you're kind of in a bubble. You had a quote in your thesis that it's clear to see when a person's letting their desires change how they see the world around them. They may cherry pick and only look at the evidence that leads to the conclusion they want. So you've been an MCA for all your educational career. How would you answer to someone that, no, I don't cherry pick. I've been given a breadth of information. I don't look at just Christian sources. How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the really good things about MCA is we don't only read Christian literature. Like, it's what we base things on, but we listen, or we look at other opinions and worldviews that are out there. And I think if you choose to stay in that Christian bubble, you can, and that's very easy to do. But I think it's important to remember that there are other options out there, and there's other things that you should know about. You don't have to agree, but it is important to know about those things. I think that's what I would say.
So if you were talking with your friends about the future and saying a family, would you want to raise your kids in a Christian education? Probably.
I think so.
Why?
Just because it agrees more with what I believe. And honestly, I mean, I've never thought about what school I would put my kids in, to be honest. But I think it agrees more with what I believe than public schools generally do. And that's also what I've grown up with, and I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
I was so glad that you brought up Psalm 37. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He'll give you the desires of your heart. And I was wondering if you would kind of talk to a younger me who read and memorized that verse and thought, okay, I'm going to delight myself in the Lord so I can get that red sports car.
I think that verse, a lot of times people use that verse to say, like, this is why God wants you to be happy. Like, this is proof of that. And I don't think that's necessarily what it is. I think it's more saying whenever because there's the context to that verse is talking to people who are Christians. And so they're saying, like, whenever you are a Christian and you have a close relationship with God, not only like your desires will start to, like I said, your desires will start to line up with what He wants. And so it may be material things that He wants for you, but I think a lot of times it's going to be probably things like fruits of the Spirit, like having loving kindness or joy in your circumstances or things like that.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah. We'll move on.
Okay, we have some online questions that people want to ask, so I'm going to give a couple of them for you. First, this is from someone who's anonymous. Does fear or confidence affect our desires more?
Does fear or confidence affect? I think for most people, it would probably be fear, because I think we want, like I said, we want to be comfortable, and so we want things that we think are good for us and that we just kind of see and we're like, oh, I want that. And so I think a lot of times we're afraid of things, we're afraid of the unknown and things that are outside of our control. So I would say fear.
Okay. Here's one, again, from someone who's anonymous. What role does progress play with desire, and is progress essential in the realm of desire?
Progress. I don't know if it's essential or not. I would have to think about that. I think it does play a role, specifically in your desires becoming more I guess, becoming less selfish and less about here's only things that I want, and becoming more of what are things that I want to do for other people, or how are things that I could make other people's lives better. I think you can progress towards that, definitely.
Yeah, and I guess there's two ways you might be able to take that, right? Progress in the larger sense of like the world progressing, right? You know, as it progresses, it shows us new things in the world. Hey, you didn't know you wanted a Tesla, but now look, hey, there is one. Or you didn't know you wanted Neuralink. Oh, but look, this actually is here, right? You know, might be able to grow our desires in different ways. Or I guess then the other way is, you know, internal progress, right? Which I'm not sure exactly which way the question is meant, but do you think the progress in the world in that sense affects our desires strongly?
Like wanting to, I guess, I think so, because you can want you can want the world to progress in different ways, depending on your worldview, but I think it definitely does.
Okay. Here's one, last one from Mr. Nelson. He seems to always make it into these. Are there times when it's more valuable to let someone just touch the stove because the pain involved will teach a better lesson?
I think so. I think it can, especially, I mean, using that analogy, if you told somebody over and over, like, don't do this, it's going to be bad for you, and then they go ahead and do it, I guess it's kind of, if they knew what was going to happen and they did it anyway, I think that's fair, yes. I think that can be beneficial.
Yeah, I would think so too. It's difficult because then it comes into the wisdom of seeing why one is better to let happen and or continue. And so I guess that gets to some of the next line of reasoning I want to pursue, which is, how come, going back to the cave, how come people would much rather stay in the cave? You know, in the illustration Plato gives, most of the people would rather be there and remain rather than go out to the sun and see the truth.
Yeah, I think not only is it just staying in things that you've always known, but part of it, I think, is staying with people that you've always known and people you agree with, because it's difficult to really believe something different from all the people that you're around, and to say, like, what if there's something else out there? Like, what if this is wrong? Because having an unpopular opinion like that could be very difficult, I think. So I think that would be one part of it.
Yeah. Do you think there's something hard about the truth itself that makes it not liked?
I think some of it depends on what the truth is. Like, we're not always going to like reality and what is true. It's not always comfortable for us, but I think ignoring it is going to be worse than just not knowing it at all, or not even trying to find out what it is.
What's intrinsically valuable about the truth? Why is it something that everyone should seek?
I think, well, first of all, as a Christian, it's important because it is something that God gives us. He gives us truth of, like, about Him and who He is. And also, I think whenever you're pursuing what is true, it's easier for things to be fair and just as well, because then you kind of, everyone's on the same page and has the same set of facts, and so then it's just easier for things to be as equal as they can be.
Yeah, I think you're right. Especially if you picture a world where there isn't any truth. You picture that goes along with that comes, justice that's not justice, and what anyone would understand. Do you think there are other things that affect our search for truth other than desires?
Yeah, I think our circumstances can. Like, sometimes it can just feel inconvenient to pursue what is true. Like, maybe you don't have enough time for it, or maybe it's just you're not really interested. I think personality can as well. Some people are, like, naturally very curious and just want to know things, and some people are just whatever. Yeah, those are two things that come to mind.
What would you say to the person who's been stuck in the mode of just logical thinking, and they let that grow way overboard, and so their rider is just completely overbearing on the elephant? What advice would you give to that person that just lets logic and facts coldly drive their whole life, and they're just fine with that?
Yeah, I think it's easy. It would be easy for that to be me. That's kind of my default sometimes. And so what I found is when I'm doing kind of in the moment, and it makes life more enjoyable, honestly, if you kind of think about the things that you do want and like what there is. I think it adds a quality to life that you don't have if you're just looking at facts.
Yeah, I think you're right. I tend to fall in that category a lot of just letting the facts, letting logic drive me. And it can be, yeah, like I think you point out here, it limits relationships. If that's the mode that you, interact with someone with, then it cuts off different ways that you empathize with them or allow yourself to empathize. And so I think you're right. So you make this statement in your oral that this does not mean that wanting one thing more than another thing is automatically going to prevent you from finding the truth about a situation. Looking at your desires and how there are some things that are good to desire, but so you can want one thing more than another thing, but I'm curious for you to unpack this. And so you say, well, this doesn't mean that it automatically is going to prevent you from finding the truth in the situation if you want one thing above another.
Yeah, I think in a lot of situations, I think it's inevitable to want one outcome more than the other. I think that's just kind of how we are. And so you do have to make an effort to, like, just because I do want this thing to be true does not mean that it is going to be true. And so I think you have to kind of remember, I may not like what I find, and I mean, it's fine to want one thing more than another thing. That happens, that's natural. But I think whenever you're using that as the compass for where you look for truth, then that is when it becomes a bad thing.
I think you're right, and I love the quote that you give from Dallas Willard, where he says that feelings properly ordered are essential for a good life. What does it look like to have those properly ordered?
I think it's the same thing as having your desires properly ordered. It's having a balance of, like, not only using your emotions to guide you, but not I read The Righteous Mind. He said that emotions are a necessary evil, which I haven't thought about that much, but basically what he meant was that emotions, they can make things more difficult because you can feel sad or angry about something, but also they can make life a lot better because you can feel things as a group. And I think when you feel like as a group you all feel happy or sad, then you're still growing closer together. And so I think emotions, they should be, they were also given to us by God, and so they are a good thing. And so it's just whenever they are the only thing driving us that they become a negative thing.
Last question, thinking about that, what do you think are the things that God desires for us to have at the top of our properly ordered life?
I think God would be at the top. I think well, in the Bible, he says to love God and to love other people, so I think those two things would be at the top. And then also, I think, it's a very churchy answer, but I think it's true, is to further God's kingdom and to, like, tell other people about him and to share that and not just keep it to yourself the whole time. I think those would probably be at the top.
Good.
So I liked what you were just telling Mr. Custer about the value